Hi, good evening. My name is Justin Stearns. I am the head of the Arab Crossroads Studies program here, and I'd like to welcome you to NYU Abu Dhabi and to the Institute this evening. This is the fourth of a series of talks that the Arab Crossroads Studies program has been running with the Institute's support this year, for which we're exceedingly grateful. And that has to do with the issue of religious diversity in the Muslim world. The first two talks last fall dealt with the pre-modern period, the origins of Shiism, and then Sunni and Shia relations in the medieval period. The third talk this past spring dealt with ibadism in Islam in general. And today we're extraordinarily fortunate to have Dr. Toby Matthiesen coming to us to talk about sectarianism in the Middle East and the Gulf today. I'm very happy to have Toby here for many reasons, not only because I can practice my Swiss German and reestablish my connection to my Swiss roots on the one hand, but even more so because his work has been really what I would regard as part of a new wave of creative scholarship on the Gulf. For those of you who are students of Middle East history will know that scholarship on this region was not always as vibrant and dynamic as it is today, and I regard Toby's work as exemplary, as part of a new wave of scholarship, which is making it important reading, not just for people interested in the Gulf, but people interested in the Middle East in general. So his first book, Sectarian Gulf, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Spring That Wasn't, was what drew my attention to him in the beginning and was published in 2013, and recently his dissertation turned into a book, came out with Cambridge, and that was The Other Saudis, Shiism, Dissent, and Sectarianism. And with that, I'm going to keep it short and turn things over to Toby. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the faculty, Your Excellencies, dear students, dear members of the Abu Dhabi public. Let me first of all thank you for coming here tonight, and thanks to the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute for inviting me to give this evening's lecture. It is a real pleasure to be back in the Gulf, especially since I'm doing critical scholarship on the Gulf. I would also particularly like to thank Justin for this really warm introduction, and Niels for doing all the work that was involved in getting me here. So I have been invited to speak about the subject of the politics of sectarianism in the Middle East. And while it is an unpleasant topic, I agree on that, and one that stirs emotions and elicits strong views, it is also of key importance to the past, present, and future of the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. And therefore, I think it is a topic that should be the subject of honest and academic discussions, rather than a subject doomed to be silent about. Over the last decade, sectarianism has become one of the key aspects of politics and society in the Middle East and beyond. The prominence of religious conflict is astonishing on several levels. First of all, it contradicts secularization and modernization theories. Not that they are necessarily very prominent in academia anymore, but they do remain very influential in politics and in public discourse, including in this part of the world. The rise of sectarianism is in part related to the resurgence of religion and new religious movements across the globe, and is therefore not something to be studied completely separate from global developments. And this is one of the points I will try to make today. In addition, it forces us to reconsider the nature of state building and state-society relations in the Middle East. States that were in the past seen as strong, nationalist, and governed by officially secular regimes, such as Iraq and Syria, fractured along ethnic and sectarian lines. And for those of you familiar with the history of these states, talking about sectarianism was a total taboo in these states, and that didn't make the issue go away. Other states in the region are on the brink of doing so, of fracturing along those lines, or have seen an upsurge in sectarian violence and polemics. The rise of sectarianism cannot be explained, I would argue, without understanding the historical political sociology of the developments of sects in the region. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I will outline what I see as a political sociology of sectarianism in the Middle East, with particular reference to the Levant, to Iraq, and to the Gulf region. The main aim of my talk is to show how religious identities developed into politically salient ethno-sectarian identities. Firstly, I will define the concept and elaborate on the historical context of sectarianism in the Middle East. Then I will point out a number of structural changes that have given rise to sectarian politics, such as the failure of secular ideologies, the emergence of distinctively Shia identity politics, and identity entrepreneurs, as well as the international dimension of communal conflict. And I will get to all these points in a bit. I think that there are a number of developments that are global, but that also affect the modern Middle East and enable the rise of sectarian politics. The waning sovereignty of the nation-state, the declining trust in political institutions, the erosion of established political parties, the rise of identity politics, as well as social, political, and economic processes associated with globalization. Sectarianism is in part an outcome of these processes and has to be understood in its socio-political and international context, rather than by looking at religious debates per se, as is sometimes done. We can define sectarianism in the Islamic context as the politicization of mainly Sunni and Shia Muslim identities. And I will not go into much detail about other forms of sectarianism, and I will not really talk about the Christians living in the Middle East or other religious groups. But we do need to be aware that we do not use sectarianism as a catch-all explanation for very different kinds of processes in very different countries and regions. In English, sectarianism is used in various ways, and quite often we read something as sectarian, and it is assumed that we understand what it means, but we often understand very different things, and so it can actually confuse our understanding of many issues. The prominence of religious and sectarian conflict in the Islamic world is astonishing on several levels. As I've mentioned, it contradicts secularization and modernization theories, which said that, religious debates and religion and politics would disappear. But we cannot really understand this rise of sectarian politics without looking at how, states were formed in the Middle East, and also how peripheries related to urban centers. And this is what I would like to get at now. Because in the Middle East, broadly speaking, and I'm quoting here the Lebanese sociologist Fuad Khouri, there is a division, over the last few centuries between urban centers where states formed their capitals and power bases, and these states were largely dominated by Sunni Islam with its acceptance of unjust rulers that are seen to be better than anarchy in Sunni political theory, and on the other hand, peripheral regions where state control was not so strong, and therefore various sects managed to establish themselves and institutionalize communal systems of social, moral, and at times political control. And that is particularly true for the Levant, but also for Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula. But when making these generalizations, we need to be aware that we don't fall into the trap of Orientalism or imperial design. Authoritarian rulers and colonial powers used the notion of eternal conflict between different religious and ethnic groups to make the case for the need of an external arbiter, a power broker. In several countries, dictators and kings still use these same arguments to justify their rule, stating that without them, the region and their countries would disintegrate into civil strife. Until fairly recently, the view of the Middle East as a mosaic of religions and ethnicities, many of whom are eternally at war with each other, dominated much of the academic and political debate about the Orient. The Orient. Now, the view of the mosaic is of course true to a certain extent, since the Middle East is home to a wide variety of religious and ethnic groups. And there have, of course, been instances of sectarian strife, of communal violence, even of pogroms in previous centuries. Under the Ottomans, different religious and sectarian groups retained considerable autonomy in religious affairs and personal status law. But I see the political sectarianism that we're talking about nowadays when we use the term sectarianism as a distinctively modern, if not postmodern phenomenon. And I would argue that the political sectarianism of the last few decades is fundamentally different because these earlier forms of political sectarianism, while being important in paving the way for the politics of the 20th century in the Middle East, have not been associated with the struggle for dominance of a modern state or with the coercive techniques available to a modern state. In the 20th century, members of a number of previously marginalized sects attained political influence in key areas of the Arab world, in part because of help from Western countries. This has changed the balance of power, whereby Sunni rulers, by and large, dominated non-Sunni communities in the core states of the Arab world. The French institutionalization of sectarianism, i.e. the proportional representation in the political system in the Levant, did much to ensure that politics would be channeled through the socio-political structures of sects. The French, for example, helped to bring about an Alawite state which lasted from 1920 to 1936. They also recruited many Alawites and members of other minorities into special branches of the army, which ensured that after independence these minorities were in a strong position. Hafiz al-Assad and his allies eventually managed to get political power through military coups, and we're grappling with the results until this day. In Iraq, the British likewise recruited selectively from certain regions, sects and tribes into the Iraqi armed forces in order to suppress rebellions in other parts of the country. But it was the US-led intervention that brought Shia Islamic parties to power. So the strengthening of various minorities as well as majorities in different countries, as well as the invention of the very concept that such a thing as a minority and a majority within a certain national boundary exists, had a profound impact. And I would say, and I will get to that a bit later, that at the same time as the invention of the modern, of how we speak of sect today, this was very much associated with the invention of nationalism in the Middle East. And I will get to that point in a minute, because before the idea came to the Middle East that there should be a nation state, the issue of a minority or a majority never really arose in the former imperial context, particularly of the Ottoman Empire. So this development of the empowerment of sects was coupled with the change of Shia understandings of religion championed by actors such as Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, the Iraqi Dawa Party, and others. Politically, these changes were symbolized by the Iranian Revolution, as well as the rise of Arab Shia in Lebanon and Iraq in the last decades. And this is another main factor that I think has contributed to the rise of the politics of sectarianism and to its importance, because a really profound shift in the kind of ways in which Shia religiosity and perceptions of politics amongst Shia Muslims were understood has occurred, particularly in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And in many ways, this is still with us today and still has very strong impact, obviously in Iran, where a Shia Islamic government is in power, but also in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, as well as here in the Gulf. So I will elaborate on this a bit later. But another key factor that I think is sometimes forgotten is that the general failure of Arab nationalism, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the corruption and brutality of the secular regimes in the region have done a lot to undermine most, if not all, secular political movements that sought to bridge different divides, and in our context, the sectarian divide. This is significant because in earlier decades, up to the 1970s, the membership of various leftist and nationalist movements was cross-sectarian, with a strong Shia participation in the Levant, in Iraq, as well as here in the Gulf, where there were also underground leftist movements. I'm particularly interested in the history of these class-based and secular political movements, and they're the subject of a new research project that I've been working on, which focuses on these movements and the role played by migrant workers, minorities, and the emergence of a public sphere here in the Gulf at mid-century. And I'm going to present a paper on that tomorrow for those of you who are interested in coming to that as well. While my work in particular focuses on the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, I think these generalizations can be made for the whole region, because across the region, different religious communities played such an important role in these movements. So Christians, for example, were paramount in the foundation of Arab nationalism. Jews, Kurds, Christians, and Shia were crucial in the Iraqi Communist Party, for example, which was one of the largest communist parties outside of Europe. Likewise, the Lebanese Communist Party had a strong cross-sectarian membership with a heavy presence of Shia Muslims. One of the main driving forces for these various groups was to overcome their minority status, escape institutionalized discrimination, and be integrated into a larger body politic, an imagined community of equals. The very notion that such a community could or should exist was, as I've mentioned, introduced to the region by the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms, which were themselves a response to European nationalism and empire. And the boundaries that came to define the nationalisms were ethnic and exclusive, which at their fault lines led to tensions. This was particularly so on the borders between the Arab world and Iran. And so in Iraq and the Gulf, Arab nationalism therefore became distinctively anti-Persian, and that did have an impact on the rise of sectarianism. Left out of nation building and nationalist historiography, Arab Shia created their own historical narratives and sociopolitical structures, something that I will focus now on in the second part of the talk. Throughout the 20th century, then, many sects in the region have undergone processes that are similar to the rise of nationalism and modern political ideologies. This partly happened in response to the failure of secular ideologies and because certain groups felt they were excluded from these ideologies, such as the problem many Arab Shia had with Arab nationalism, partly because of its distinct anti-Persian tone. I will elaborate this now on the basis of the case studies of the Shia in Eastern Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain. As Justin mentioned, I've written my PhD on this topic, and in these cases, sectarian identities have become almost like a marker of ethnicity. Indeed, the conflict there has taken on many forms of ethnic strife. So it is important to remember that I'm not just talking about religion or religious beliefs, but it is religion in its social and political context that matters. For example, the Shia of Eastern Saudi Arabia and Bahrain share common historical memories and narratives which are being written down, published, and reenacted by local historians and what I call identity entrepreneurs. They very much relate to territory and to an imagined community that once was, where they thought that they were once united in a mythical homeland, which they refer to as ancient Bahrain. In the Bahraini and Saudi case, there is a sense that this is also associated with a shared descent, i.e. similar to ethnic nationalism. In fact, these are all features that all ethnic kind of nationalist movements take really seriously. So while these historical narratives are only partly reenacted in public, Ashura rituals serve to annually reinforce general narratives of oppression, resistance, and victimhood that are central to Shiism. Ashura is the 10th day of the month of Muharram, and Shia Muslims commemorate on that day the martyrdom of Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson and third Imam, according to Shia Muslims, in 680. These have become counter-mobilizations, creating alternative publics to the state-sponsored nationalist historiography and reenactments that often glorify Sunni and Arab tribal identities. In many ways, these mobilizations and narratives are reactions to institutionalized discrimination. Because the Shia are recognizable with often very distinct names and a particular dialect, institutional discrimination is quite easy to administer. In response to this, Gulf Shia, particularly since the 1970s, so this is all associated to these general changes in the region that I referred to earlier, Gulf Shia founded communal Islamist movements which seek to both change the statutes of the community and enforce public morality and Islamic norms. The rise of communal Islamist movements as a subtype of Islamist movements has also occurred in many other countries in the region and has exacerbated sectarian strife in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and to a lesser extent even Kuwait. So who profits from sectarianism? States and actors that I define as sectarian identity entrepreneurs use sectarianism as a strategy and are key in strengthening ethno-sectarian identities. The notion of the entrepreneur who capitalizes on certain forms of identity formation is taken from the instrumentalist study of ethnicity. And people associated with this particular line of inquiry argued that collective identities could be used as political resources by competing interest groups. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing across the region. The very strong relationship between business and politics in the Middle East has facilitated this trend. This is true in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and many other countries in the region. But the spectacular rise in resources available to Gulf states has also allowed the more sectarian views prominent in some Gulf states to be spread more widely across the region, and has turned members of the Gulf merchant and ruling families into identity entrepreneurs themselves. This has particularly struck me during field work in Kuwait, a very rich country, which probably has the most open political and media system in the Gulf, and hence issues that cannot be studied really in other countries are very clear in Kuwait. Kuwait lies at the intersection of regional fault lines, and many different actors, including sectarian groups, get money, political support, and media coverage from there. This is also true for transnational Shia movements, but also for the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or even Daesh. In addition, an analysis of its parliamentary election shows how the political system is based on regionalism, tribalism, and sectarianism. So people vote in kind of primaries, even though they're illegal, to select candidates for their particular ethnic or religious group. This group-based politics plays into the hands of the ruling elites, who then present themselves as standing above these divisions, as the only ones who are able to handle these divisions and possible conflicts arising from them. One can also observe the same in Bahrain, for example. And I think what is crucial is that identity entrepreneurs increasingly operate across national boundaries, and this is key for the escalation of various conflicts in the region. So we see, for example, cross-border funding and support given by Shia identity entrepreneurs from Kuwait to the opposition in Bahrain, or even to the Syrian regime, and by their Sunni equivalents to the militants in Syria. War economies, which have become the new norm across the Levant and in Iraq, especially play into the hands of such entrepreneurs. But apart from the transnational dimension, so of individuals getting involved somewhere else with a non-state actor, there's also the international dimension, whereby states play a key role in fueling sectarian conflict. All the communal conflicts in the Middle East would have been much less devastating were it not for the involvement of outside actors, most often neighboring states, as well as regional and global powers. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, particularly since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, has constantly connected localized conflicts, which might have been about something very different, apart from sect, has connected these localized conflicts to middle power rivalry between these two states. The Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990 was a key example of this, and perhaps the earliest and most bloody example. But similar developments have since become visible in many other countries, such as in Iraq and Syria. Increasingly, this internationalization of communal conflict has also affected Bahrain, Yemen, and other places. Dynamics within Shiism also play a role, as I've mentioned previously. Iran has sought to assert its influence amongst Arab Shia communities, particularly since 1979, but has met fierce resistance in this regard, particularly over the last couple of years. The majority of Arab Shia have historically looked to Najaf and Karbala as their spiritual centers, and since the fall of Saddam in 2003, these centers, which were previously almost closed for students and pilgrims, have once again resumed their centrality as Shia centers of learning. There is a large group of Shia Muslims who do not support the strategies of Iran or Hezbollah and want to take more accommodation, want to seek more accommodation and agreements with their Sunni counterparts and think that the policies of Iran in Iraq and Syria are very bad. This group has as its spiritual leader Sayyid Ali as-Sistani, the probably most important Shia cleric in the world, but has supporters elsewhere, including key figures amongst Gulf Shia. So the nature of the relationship between non-Iranian Shia communities and Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, are nuanced, much more so than many commentators and decision makers in the Middle East, particularly also in the GCC, think they are. However, as the sectarian conflict in the region gets worse and people backtrack into their primordial identities and immediate social support systems, these critical voices become less important and less heard because they cannot provide the same kind of immediate security that the other forces can. So we cannot deny the fact that tensions have increased since 2011 and that sectarianism has played a stronger role in the ways states have projected power abroad and in the ways they have viewed their citizens. Again, this is particularly true with regards to the Gulf states and Iran, but also to Iraq, Syria, and increasingly elsewhere, including in states where minorities never posed a risk to the states in question. But the sectarian reading of events should not be overemphasized and particularly not used as a catch-all explanation. A case in point is Yemen, where the newest conflict in the Middle East has just broken out. I would like to remind you that at the height of the Arab Cold War, that in the 1960s pitted Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser against the Saudi monarchs King Saud and later King Faisal, Egypt intervened on the side of a Republican group of officers who had ousted the Zaydi monarchy in a coup in 1962. Saudi Arabia henceforth backed the Zaydi royalist forces in a vicious 5-year civil war because it feared the spreading of Arab nationalism and anti-monarchy forces in the Arabian Peninsula. The successors of these armed Zaydi tribes that were used against the Republican regime constitute now the backbone of the Houthi movement, which many Saudi clerics now describe as heretics against whom it is legitimate to wage war. So Yemen should really serve as a reminder that sectarianism is used by identity entrepreneurs, political movements, and states to further their aims. And it is not a teleological explanation of Middle Eastern and Islamic history and should not be used or read as such. So let me just make a couple of points to conclude, and then I will open up the floor to answer your questions. To sum up, I think both developments within Islam and the Middle East, as well as on the global level, have really led to this spectacular rise in sectarian politics. In the Middle East, in particular, I think it is the defeat of secular developmentalism and secular kind of political movements, the rise of Gulf oil money, the Iranian Revolution, and so on and so forth, that all fed the development of contemporary sectarianism. At the same time, the empowerment of Shia movements in core states of the region and changes in Shia political identities that are associated with this empowerment have led to fears amongst the old Sunni elites, who in turn supported a sectarian backlash. But sectarianism is also related to political economy and geopolitics, with similar functions and logics as ethnic nationalism, and I think that is worth remembering. And it is also a sign of a crisis of religious authority in Islam, because over the course of the 20th century, the kind of key scholars of the different Sunni schools of Islam as well as of Shiism met repeatedly in kind of an effort to bridge the religious divide between the different groups. So for example, the key scholars in the Hawza in Najaf, which is the most important Shia religious school, and the Azhar in Cairo, which for the Sunnis serves as the most important school, sat together and agreed to work out, get over their differences. And the Azhar actually recognized Shiism as a valid school of Islam. So on the level of the leadership of the different religious communities, there's actually, I think, also historically, there was a will to overcome these kind of religious polemics and stop political conflict turning into religious conflict. But today, what we see is that lower-ranking scholars or mid-ranking scholars who do not have such a strong position in these traditional institutions, but can reach audiences of millions of people on the internet and via social media, have really taken on the sectarian message as one of the key drivers for them to become very popular. And once this kind of sectarian message has been uploaded to the internet, it is very difficult to rein it in, and it will stay there for years and perhaps decades to come. And we see so many examples of this today on social media. And these things, in turn kind of both extremists on both sides feed on each other. They say, oh, well, someone who maybe only has like 100, 200 followers has said something in a mosque in London, in some suburb, and then it will be taken up by someone who sits in his bedroom and makes up a video insulting the other sect. And so there is a very dangerous, I think, dynamic at play here on the religious level, even though one would have thought that the religious debates are already kind of more or less resolved. So this leads me to my last point, that sectarianism, as we see it today, is actually related to processes of postmodernity and is a fundamentalist phenomenon trying to ascribe fixed categories and identities where these have eroded, become fluid and hybrid, be it through massive socioeconomic changes, urbanization, political disruptions, wars, new technologies, or changes in social structures, social control, and public morality. So for many people, sectarian identity has become one of the ways in which to absorb these kind of changes and try to make sense of life. So on this note, I will end, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to some, hopefully, very polemical questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. You didn't mention anything about the failure of the nationalist movements, both in Iran in the 50s after the American-supported coup d'etat, and similarly the takeover in the Arabic countries by the regime in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and in Syria, which led to the fragmentation of all the secular political movements. And also, in the early 50s, when Mossadegh was overthrown, many of the movements, whether in Persia, in Turkey, in all of the Middle East, were part of the Third World liberation movements post the Second World War. Mm-hmm. How did they play, and what factors did these three things affect the current situation? Thank you.
Very good question. Maybe I'll just take that, as it's a very big question. Well, I think I tried to point out the role of the West in the rise of sectarianism. these events that you mentioned, particularly the overthrow of Mossadegh, obviously, I think was a real mistake. I mean, it really affected the way the whole region developed after that. And you're right to say that in the 50s and 60s, there was a real attempt to kind of new Arab leaders to become part of the kind of non-alignment movement. I mean, Nasser founded the non-alignment movement in the Bandung conference together with Nehru and others. So there was a real sense that Arab leaders, Arab nationalist leaders were looking for a third way in some ways of modernizing, but without being necessarily used by one or the other side in the Cold War. Now, that didn't work out, and there are very many reasons for the failure of these political projects that we cannot go into now, but whatever the reasons, the outcome has been that political Islam emerged as the main new ideology, and I think you cannot explain the rise of sectarianism without the rise of political Islam, because as soon as you define yourself as an Islamist, the question of what kind of Islam becomes more important than if you're a communist, for example, or if you're an Arab nationalist, or if you're an Iranian nationalist. And I think that's one of the issues that we should think about.
Thank you. I'm a local investment advisor. I'd like to ask a slightly crude question about the economics of being a sectarian identity entrepreneur, as you put it. I mean, I have to, if I was one of these activist individuals, I would have to put my own resources into this sort of activity. What is, and I mention it because we've seen the tremendous commercial success of Daesh as a very ruthless, but also now quite a wealthy organization. How do the incentives work, and how do you develop the enterprise, as it were? And when do people give up on this line of activity as well?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I've never been asked that by an investment advisor, but maybe I should refine my argument. Yeah, I mean, the Syrian revolution turned towards civil war is, I think, a classic case in point. You had an uprising, a mass uprising starting, which very quickly turned into armed conflict. And there were donors abroad, particularly from the Gulf, willing to support groups, but it was difficult to find out who and what that exactly was. So that's when you had the hundreds of militias appearing, and every militia has a leader who has some form of ideology, and they kind of differentiate themselves according to different things. And so these people would classically identify as such identity entrepreneurs, and would put forward the views that their donors would like them to espouse. That is on the kind of receiving end. Obviously, yeah, I mean, for example, in Kuwait, where I studied this, I mean, it can be quite good for you if you're a big businessman and you take a strong kind of line in that regard. You will kind of support perhaps one political party. You will found a newspaper where then all the people will kind of from your community will advertise and so on. They will go to your shops. They will use your bank because you obviously have a bank if you're that person. They will go to your petrol station. And so on and so forth. So a lot is related to political economy. I'm talking about different kinds of individuals that use this kind of language to further their aims. So they can be actually quite different people, but they all profit from this. And I suppose does it stop? I think when it doesn't become profitable anymore, or a new kind of discourse emerges, or when it's banned, for example, sectarian hate speech. It's not banned, unfortunately, in the states where it matters. Although in Kuwait, it's actually technically banned, and people go to jail also but then you can tone it down like one notch, and it's not. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about what seems to be happening, especially in the Gulf, is that there is this overlaying of a Sunni Shia division over the Arab versus Iranian, or as people like to say, Persian economy, basically. And some scholars are of the opinion that the Iran-Iraq War was really the way where Saddam really set up the Iranians as the Persian enemy that the Arabs had to conquer. But at the same time, you mentioned that Arab Shia were uncomfortable with the notion of Arab nationalism in the 50s and 60s. So where do you stand on this? What are the ideological origins within Arab nationalism where you could maybe find some evidence of an Arab versus Persian narrative emerging, and who were the entrepreneurs in that sense?
That's another very good question. It's a very nice audience here. I mean, the origins, it is a bit of a problem reading history backwards. If we look nowadays for the kind of anti-Shiism, you can, of course, to a certain extent, trace it back to the kind of Persian monarchy versus the Ottomans. So there was always some tension there. But, yeah, I mean, especially in Iraq and in Kuwait, actually, and in other places also in Bahrain and in the 50s and 60s, you had a very strong anti kind of Iran narrative. And I went through the newspapers of the time, and these were not these were the main kind of newspapers because the intellectuals that wrote in these newspapers, they'd been educated in the centers of Arab nationalism, and then came back in the 40s and 50s and established the first newspapers and the public sphere, and so on and so forth. People like Saddam obviously fed on that. So I don't think there's like one, we cannot really point to like one particular incident. The discourse was always kind of there, but then it was also not there for long periods of time. Obviously, under the Shah, relations were good with many states. I mean, the Shah helped to put down the Dhofar rebellion, for example, which is the reason why, one of the main reasons why Sultan Qaboos is still in power today. I mean, so the Shah helped a kind of a Gulf monarchy in the 70s. So things are not so simple, obviously. But I think one of the key questions that really still puzzle me and I think many others is why, if we adopt this kind of Sunni Shia narrative and Arabs versus Persians and so on, why and the kind of export of the revolution, of the Iranian revolution. So why did the Iraqi Shia not rise up in the Iran-Iraq war and just took over the country? Or like, why did they actually fight in the Iraqi army against the Iranians? I mean, and a lot of Shia died on the Iraqi side. So I think that probably shows us that other factors are much more important, or at least were at that time much more important than religious affinity. And also that really explains that there is there's a real tension also between Iranian and Arab Shiism in some ways. But I think there are policies that are happening, or there are things that are happening now which are lessening these, obviously, these divisions. And the situation as it is now in Iraq is such a situation, if that makes sense.
You mentioned the concept of the identity entrepreneur and asked the question, who benefits from a sectarian state and the sectarian divide? Throughout the narrative of the incidents that happened or the major milestones in the past century, I noticed that you did not mention the creation of a Zionist state in the Middle East and its impact on the sectarian divide as one of the stakeholders that benefited and some argue fueled the divide.
Yes, Israel obviously benefits from any kind of division amongst its neighbors and in the wider Arab and Islamic world. And I'm sure it doesn't mind if the kind of big powers in the region fight each other rather than fight Israel. In fact, make an alliance with Israel at the moment to fight another Middle Eastern country or several. So, but at the same time, you know, I mean, there is a tendency in the Middle East to blame everything on Israel and just, you know, basically Israel is responsible for everything. So, I mean, I think the Sunni-Shia conflict, might not be totally responsible for everything that, you know, it might profit from it, yes. So it might, do some things that further this. But in general, I mean, it's also a lot of Arab countries, you know, who kind of profit from this, probably more than Israel, because the Arab regimes stay in power because they use it. For Israel, yeah, it's more of a side issue. But I agree. I mean, it has been long been kind of an imperialist dream to separate the Arab world, and Israel is continuing with that policy. Actually, I think Kissinger, there's a famous Kissinger quote which said, "This is great, Sunni and Shia against each other, that's exactly what we want, and this will secure our presence for decades to come." And well, here we are today in the Gulf discussing this, so thank you for your question.
You commented earlier on some of the mistakes that the West has made in the Middle East, and right now there are the negotiations with Iran, the diplomatic negotiations, and I'm wondering which has the Israelis upset, but it also has King Salman and many of the other Middle East countries upset. So I'm wondering how you think those negotiations will play out, if the West has any hidden agendas in them, and what's your take in general on how the impact will be on the Middle East?
That's an important question as well. We don't know if this deal what will happen with it. So it's very difficult to speculate at the moment what will happen. And I think actually the biggest problem is in the United States, and it's not that related to the Middle East, even though perhaps actors from the Middle East are trying to influence American politics. But that's something that I just, you know, don't particularly understand. On the Middle East, yeah, for sure, it would change things here, and I know that many people on the Arab side of the Gulf are afraid of what might happen. But I think some of the fears might also be overblown. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a total diplomatic shift of American or European kind of foreign policy away from the GCC towards Iran. I mean, the differences between, the ideology of the Islamic Republic, while it might be undergoing some small adjustments, is still, kind of revolutionary and directed against the West. So I think there are limits to how a rapprochement can play out. At the same time, many of the conflicts in the region are now effectively proxy wars. I don't think they're sectarian wars. I tried to make that clear, I think, in the presentation, but it's states using sectarian identity. So if we accept that, then, I mean, Syria, Iraq, perhaps now Yemen, and other places, these conflicts cannot be solved without the involvement of everybody and who has a stake. And there's no denying that Iran does have a stake and significant influence in these places. So in that sense, a deal or already kind of just negotiations, I think, are probably a good thing because they open up channels of communication which were not there previously, and I think the kind of American-Iranian dynamic has been very unhealthy for the region for a long time, and it goes back to Mossadegh and that whole period, and I think some readjustment of that is beneficial. Now, what is going to happen here in the Gulf? What actions Gulf governments will take? I don't know. I think the Yemen intervention is probably not, one cannot probably detach it from these negotiations. I think it's partly a way to show the Americans that, the Gulf states can now be very proactive on their own and they will defend their interests without necessarily waiting for someone else to do it for them or give them a green light necessarily as well. So so in that sense, the negotiations have already had a significant impact. But what exactly the outcome will be, I also don't know. We will all be surprised, maybe. I don't know.
Of course, it's very easy, both within the region and outside the region, to see sort of wherever sort of Sunnis and Shias live, sort of like in close proximity, you're going to have sectarian issues. But then sort of like kind of bringing it sort of like closer to home here within the Gulf and specific, I mean, we have in the Gulf, you have the issues very much within Saudi Arabia, within Bahrain, and to a certain extent Kuwait. But then at the same time, here within the UAE and Qatar, you do have Shia communities living alongside Sunni communities. But then we seem blessedly sort of like free of the sectarian issues which have cursed other countries. I'm just wondering if you can give any sort of comment as to why that's the case. I mean, why those issues don't seem to be as prevalent here and in Qatar. Is it the strength of the state? Is it the sort of the numbers being smaller? Is it economic empowerment? Just wondered what the factors behind that are, in your opinion.
Well, so Kuwait and Bahrain have parliaments and have a press where you can discuss domestic politics. And Saudi Arabia, the eastern province, just has a very long history of political mobilization, and that there are large Shia communities living there. So I think, as far as I know, in Qatar and the UAE, domestic politics or religion is not debated in public. So that might be one factor. But also, I mean, the numbers are just much smaller. The percentage is not a percentage that is somehow, threatening the state or the status quo. And we have never seen political movements emerge amongst these communities in the UAE or in Qatar, or in Oman, for that matter. And that is in part because actually, I mean, as far as I don't know much about that, but I think in the UAE it's a lot of just wealthy business families that are Shia and perhaps of Iranian origin, although some of them now don't want to be so Iranian origin anymore. But I think so that it's obviously different if you're an unemployed 18-year-old in a Bahraini village or in Qatif. Then if you're a CEO of a company, it might also you might get annoyed by some of the sectarian discourse that is now common to the whole Arab world to some extent, but also to the GCC more broadly. But the grievances will be very different, and I think I think particularly Oman has done an okay job in obviously managing religious diversity. As has actually Kuwait in some ways, so the problem is really, I think, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but also for different reasons. It's not the same reason, because in Bahrain the problem is not religious either. I think it's politics and political economy. It's just Bahrain doesn't have the huge resources that the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait have. And have a relatively big population for that, and so you need to distribute it to a smaller. You distribute it to the people who you like, and here I think there is just more wealth. So that might not be a very good explanation, but it is. And I have never done research on this here, so I don't know exactly. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to have you all join me in thanking Dr. Toby Matthiesen once again. Thank you.
Thank you.